We stand at the precipice of understanding. Having seen the shadows, the mere echoes cast upon the cave wall by someone else's assumptions, we must now face the terrifying, blinding light that awaits us beyond the exit. This transition is not merely a physical journey. It is a profound descent into self-knowledge and civic duty. For what is true governance if not an attempt to manage the chaos of human ignorance? Plato argued that the city, like the soul, requires rational order to thrive. But achieving this ideal state demands more than mere laws written on parchment. It requires people whose understanding comes first from rigorous contemplation of reality itself. The greatest challenge, then, is identifying who possesses this pure vision. How does one distinguish between a skilled orator, someone who merely manipulates language and emotions for power, and a philosopher? The philosopher, in Plato's view, does not seek to rule because it promises wealth or comfort. Their deepest desire is simply to understand the forms, justice itself, beauty itself, goodness itself. This pure pursuit of wisdom makes them fundamentally detached from worldly ambitions. This detachment, this intellectual clarity, becomes the foundational pillar for any just society. If the rulers are swayed by greed, fear, or the fleeting flattery of popular opinion, the city will inevitably descend into tyranny and disorder. The state's health is directly linked to the virtue of its decision-makers. Therefore, if one truly understands what justice means, not simply as a legal compromise between powerful men, but as an internal harmony, where every part performs its optimal function, then only those who have mastered this inner architecture can govern justly. Consider the argument that knowledge should be power. Plato refined this concept into something far more profound. Understanding is the highest form of moral authority. A man who has spent his life tracing the forms, mapping out the perfect ideals through pure reason, views the messy reality of human politics as a kind of puzzle waiting for logical arrangement. He does not feel superior in a petty way. He feels burdened by responsibility. The knowledge gained is a torch that cannot simply be set aside, because it illuminates necessary truths about human behavior and governance. The society thus becomes an echo chamber for the disciplined mind. It must structure itself so that the guardians, those who share this philosopher-king calling, are shielded from the distractions and bribes of material life. They must dedicate their entire existence to reason, training themselves not merely in mathematics or dialectic, but in self-control until that control is absolute. Their rule, consequently, cannot be a matter of force, like that wielded by soldiers motivated by plunder. It must be gentle, guiding the less knowledgeable populations towards stability and truth. This ideal state is therefore built on profound sacrifice, the sacrifice of personal freedom for civic perfection. The philosopher accepts this demanding role because they recognize that ignorance in the masses leads to a slow, subtle kind of spiritual slavery. And the ruler's first duty, drawing from that contemplation, must be to govern themselves completely, achieving an inner republic before attempting to impose order on an outer one. It is an immense burden. To know the perfect path and see others stumbling blindly toward shadows, this creates a moral imperative for action. The philosopher does not rule because they are cleverer. They rule because they have seen too clearly the cost of letting people mistake opinion for truth, believing that mere rhetoric can construct justice, where only rigorous thought can build it. Their rule is less about dictation and more about patient enlightenment, a necessary shepherd guiding sheep away from the edge of the cliff. The weight of this understanding separates them utterly from ordinary life. They must reject material comforts because these are precisely the things that erode reason and foster subjective desires. A king motivated by gold will legislate for wealth. A philosopher king legislates for the soul's well-being, even if that law is unpopular or economically inconvenient in the short term. Their allegiance is to the good itself, not to the tax base or the military expenditure. And this rejection of worldly desires leads directly back to the core premise. True power resides solely within reason. If the rulers govern through their deepest capacity for contemplation, if they live according to the forms they have apprehended, then their rule cannot falter under the pressures that dismantle ordinary political structures. They are guided by unchanging, universal principles. This is why Plato envisioned not a democracy of equals, but a highly structured aristocracy of merit and intellect, governed by those few who possess genuine wisdom. We have journeyed into the deepest recesses of thought, questioning not just what we see, but how truly real that which we perceive to be. We stand at a threshold where mere observation gives way to deep intellectual doubt. The shadows on the cave wall were potent enough. They shaped our myths and dictated our understanding of justice and truth for generations. But Plato urges us deeper, compelling us to challenge the very framework of knowledge itself. He asks us to pause and consider, what if the beliefs that structure your entire life are themselves reflections? What if the reality you prize is merely a consensus, a persistent echo in the chamber of human agreement? This dialogue with shadows becomes an interrogation of assumptions. It challenges the comforting certainty that defines polite society, forcing us instead toward a difficult, unyielding self-examination. Who among us truly knows what they think to know? This is not merely an academic question. It touches the core of ethical duty and political legitimacy. To accept the shadows is comfortable because they are predictable. They belong to familiar narratives, the stories told by authority, the laws passed by decree, the traditions upheld simply because we always have. But genuine philosophy demands that we pry apart these comforting attachments, pulling at the threads until the entire tapestry of accepted reality begins to fray. The initial shock of this doubt can be paralyzing. It strips away the titles and positions we have built our identities upon. It makes us question not just external rulers, but the very architecture of our own internal certainties. We realize that much of what passes for knowledge is merely mimicry, a habit of believing without foundational proof. If even the concept of reality is subject to such intense scrutiny, then the stability of human governance must also be questioned. The assumption that those currently in power possess superior insight or inherent moral authority collapses under this persistent intellectual pressure. We are forced into a vulnerable position, standing naked before the possibility that the wisest among us may not be the loudest, nor the most adorned with temporal power. Instead, genuine wisdom begins to appear like a quiet ache, a persistent questioning that cannot be dismissed by rote agreement or political expediency. This profound skepticism is necessary because it clears the ground. It removes the sediment of mere opinion so that something true might finally take root. But this critical path is not gentle. It demands an unending vigilance against self-deception, requiring us to become expert skeptics of our own minds as much as we are of others. This questioning builds tremendous intellectual force, a transformative kind of doubt that cannot be easily silenced by rhetoric or spectacle. It moves beyond simply asking what is true. It forces us to reckon with the methodology of truth itself. How do we separate genuine insight from charismatic persuasion? The shades of belief surrounding us often look very real. They wear convincing clothes and speak with passionate conviction, yet they are fundamentally detached from objective understanding. This chapter teaches us that intellectual humility, this constant state of being unsure yet always questioning, is the first essential tool for citizenship. It is the acknowledgement that certainty is usually the refuge of those who have stopped thinking deeply enough to fear the consequences of a true inquiry. We learn that before we can discuss how a city should be ruled, or what justice means in practice, we must first master the art of questioning our own foundations. This self-imposed period of intellectual discomfort is thus not an end in itself, but a harsh prerequisite for any lasting understanding. It is preparing us, slowly and painfully, to bear the weight of clarity. The journey towards understanding the ideal state is not a pleasant one. It does not begin in halls of comfortable debate, nor through simple acquiescence to accepted norms. Rather, it begins with the searing discomfort of realizing how deeply mistaken we often are about reality itself. We have seen the shadows, and now we must face the blinding, uncomfortable nature of truth. This confrontation with knowledge is fundamentally difficult because truth, by its very nature, resists comfort. It does not seek out praise or applause, it simply exists, hard and sharp, demanding attention. This clarity, this rigorous philosophical illumination, carries a profound burden. To see things as they truly are, to recognize the vast difference between the comforting illusion and the cold architecture of truth, is exhausting. The mind rebels against this intensity. It prefers the familiar half-lie to the full, painful light. We are trained from childhood to prioritize social harmony and immediate ease over intellectual precision. Wisdom demands a withdrawal from that collective agreement. The philosopher is thus caught in an impossible tension. They have glimpsed the perfect geometry of justice, yet they exist within the messy, ill-formed curves of human politics. They see the flaw in the premise, the imbalance in the law, and the emotional corruption at the heart of civic duty. This vision, however pure, inevitably becomes a source of alienation. To possess this elevated clarity is to be perpetually misunderstood. It means that your deepest insights, the very principles you hold sacred, that governance must follow rational necessity, not popular whim, will often sound like cold radicalism to those who only value immediate satisfaction or emotional solidarity. People crave certainties, simple slogans, easy blame, digestible narrative arcs. They do not want the complex, demanding process of critical thought. The pain lies in translating the perfect logic of the forms into the imperfect language and flawed institutions of human life. One must take a vision conceived under the quiet contemplation of reason and try to apply it where men have only applied emotion. It is a form of philosophical grief, the knowledge that the structure designed by pure thought may be structurally incompatible with the chaotic nature of the living body politic. This intellectual difficulty makes the notion of rule deeply fraught. If the best governance requires individuals who can sacrifice personal desires, wealth, and status for the abstract good, a demanding asceticism that few men are willing to embrace, then whose authority is truly natural or desirable. It raises difficult questions about consent itself. Is true consent possible when the voters, or the populace, do not even understand what they are consenting to, or when their deepest needs might be better served by a carefully ordered hand, rather than left entirely to the fluctuating tides of opinion? The burden of clarity forces us into this agonizing philosophical dilemma. Should those who grasp universal truth relinquish political power for their own sake, choosing only contemplation and withdrawal? Or must they step forward, willingly embracing the potential scorn and instability that accompanies guiding a society toward genuine self-mastery? To choose silence is to abandon the possibility of improvement. To act risks the immediate bitterness of failure. The philosopher cannot merely theorize about justice. They are faced with the consequence of inaction. The stability he craves, the rationally ordered polis, may be unattainable in a world driven by rhetoric and passion. Yet, withdrawing into academia, into pure contemplation, seems to amount to an abandonment of human responsibility itself. The fire of reason demands application. This chapter is thus defined by the weight of understanding. That profound knowledge is not merely an intellectual asset, but an ethical burden. It requires a life lived in tension. The tension between the perfect ideal and the broken reality, the tension between knowing better and being powerless to enforce what is necessary. The clarity we seek costs us comfort, popular support, and often our peace of mind. Yet, recognizing this difficulty is itself the first step toward virtue, marking the difficult path away from illusion and towards the arduous task of building a more just human life. The light, when finally grasped, does not promise ease. It offers a blinding clarity that the unprepared mind struggles to bear. Imagine trying to explain universal justice to a crowd accustomed only to petty squabbles and immediate comforts. They are looking for simple slogans, easily digestible truths that confirm their existing prejudices. But what is wisdom if it demands constant intellectual labor? How do you reconcile the sublime purity of an ideal form with the messy reality of human politics? It is here that Plato's profound disillusionment emerges. He saw the dazzling blueprint of a perfectly ordered city in his mind, a place governed solely by pure reason, where every individual knew their true function and contributed only what they were designed for. Yet, when he looked at the Athenian democracy surrounding him, he saw not the echoes of ideal harmony, but a chaotic carnival of fleeting desires. The problem was misalignment. The people loved freedom, certainly. They prized autonomy above all else. But Plato argued that this popular definition of freedom, the ability to do whatever one pleases, was often merely license, and license is rarely synonymous with true liberty. True liberty, he suggested, required self-mastery, a disciplined obedience to reason's highest command. The masses were thus perceived as being perpetually unready, like students who have never been given the tools or the patience required for real learning. It becomes an agonizing conflict within the philosopher's heart, the knowledge of the necessary good versus the painful impossibility of achieving it in flawed humanity. Do we speak the truth and risk misunderstanding, mockery, or even violence? Or do we remain silent, safe within our intellectual bubble, maintaining peace at the cost of spiritual integrity? This is the crucible of wisdom meeting political reality. Plato felt a profound sense of intellectual despair. He knew the cure for the soul, the disciplined ascent out of the cave, but he also recognized the powerful gravitational pull toward ignorance that held society captive. It was a recognition of human stubbornness, the collective preference for comfortable illusions over demanding truth. The philosopher, therefore, finds himself perpetually positioned between two poles: the detached intellectual who merely observes and records the truth, or the sacrificial leader who must actively fight to impose a superior order upon a recalcitrant populace. He realizes that if he wishes justice to prevail, if he wants humanity guided toward the contemplation of the good, then someone must assume the immense, solitary burden of ruling. The governance of men is not merely an academic exercise. It is a moral imperative demanding total self-abnegation. Those who claim to rule must first master themselves completely. They cannot be motivated by wealth, glory, or even love for political power itself. Their sole guiding principle must be the unwavering pursuit of the universal good. If the leaders are driven by personal ambition, then no matter how brilliant the law is conceived, it will inevitably serve self-interest, leading only to corruption and decay. This necessity leads directly to the most difficult conclusion, that the philosopher must become the ultimate guardian of the state's soul. Their duty surpasses merely offering advice. They must enforce clarity upon a foggy consciousness. This role requires not just deep knowledge, but immense moral fortitude, a willingness to suffer misunderstanding and scorn, because the alternative is the stagnation of the soul itself. The philosopher's rule, then, emerges as less about political domination and more about intellectual necessity. It is the establishment of order guided by pure reason. Only those who have stared into the burning clarity of the forms, those whose souls are already trained to disregard material pleasure or fleeting public praise, can truly see what constitutes justice for all men. They must sacrifice personal comfort, their own reputation, even their lives, in favor of maintaining this higher civic harmony. It is a tragic calling, for it asks humanity to treat knowledge as a privilege wielded only by the few, the intellectually disciplined minority. It is an acknowledgement that democracy, when left unchecked by philosophical reason, tends toward tyranny through mere majority rule, becoming enslaved to appetite rather than reasoned law. Therefore, the state requires not just laws, but guardians whose primary commitment remains solely to truth itself. The lesson resonates throughout time. True leadership demands a kind of radical self-discipline, a continuous refusal to be swayed by the popular tide. It means choosing the demanding path of rationality over the seductive ease of emotional agreement. And this choice defines the philosopher's unavoidable responsibility, that they must guide, or even rule, when wisdom is desperate enough to find no other audience but the state itself. We have seen how the comfortable acceptance of illusions keeps humanity asleep. We confronted the painful realization that mere opinion is not knowledge, and that understanding reality requires a brutal ascent from the cave's dimmest corners into the blinding light of pure reason. This journey itself suggests an inevitable truth about governance. If ignorance rules, then wisdom cannot flourish. Therefore, we must consider the nature of the state most fit to house genuine justice. The city-state, for Plato, is merely a reflection of the ordered mind. If the soul seeks harmony, if reason governs appetite and spirit, then the ideal political community must mirror that perfect inner structure. It cannot be left to chance, nor can it simply follow the fluctuating desires of the masses who mistake spectacle for substance. Consider the flaws we have identified in existing societies. They are governed by passion, greed, or the fleeting pronouncements of the powerful. These rulers, driven by self-interest, inevitably treat justice as a mere transactional commodity, something to be bought, sold, or suppressed when convenient. They mistake freedom for license, believing that unbounded appetite equates to true liberty. But what is genuine liberty? Plato suggests it is not absence of restraint. Rather, it is the state of being governed by reason. A person truly free from internal bondage will naturally seek to govern the city with a similarly pure rationale. The individual soul requires hierarchy. Reason must preside over spirit, which in turn must regulate the physical desires. This perfected inner architecture must logically extend outward into the civic sphere. The philosopher is thus positioned not merely as a teacher or an advisor, but as the necessary architect of this ordered reality. Why? Because only those who have spent their lives pursuing the unchanging forms, the eternal truths of justice itself, or goodness itself, are truly capable of seeing these underlying structures in human law and social organization. The philosopher's training is a rigorous discipline that strips away attachment to wealth, status, and physical comfort. They train themselves to detach from what passes for worldly good, making them immune to the corrupting influences that plague politicians driven by ambition. Their commitment becomes purely intellectual. Their highest calling is the maintenance of systemic rational integrity. This detachment makes them uniquely suited to rule. A man who values stability and justice over personal accumulation will make decisions guided only by what ensures the flourishing of the collective, not merely the comfort of his own estate or lineage. He possesses a vision that transcends generations, a blueprint for human potential realized in stone and law. The ideal state, the republic, is thus structured hierarchically to reflect this rational order. At its apex are the guardians, who embody the philosophical life. They must be tasked with governance because they alone perceive the whole pattern, recognizing how each part of the city, the laborers, the auxiliaries, and themselves, relates to the supreme good. Their knowledge is not just academic, it is prescriptive, demanding action. It is a profound burden, this mandate for selfless leadership. The philosopher does not seek power. Rather, they recognize that because humanity consistently fails to govern itself rationally, someone must step forward out of moral necessity. They see the suffering caused by internal discord and external vice, and understand that systemic guidance requires absolute intellectual mastery. The resistance to this idea is immense. People prefer the comforting chaos ruled by recognizable tyrants or merchants than the austere discipline demanded by true reason. To be governed by the pure intellect feels alien, perhaps even restrictive, to those who value immediate gratification above lasting harmony. Yet for Plato, the cost of inaction, of allowing the rule of appetite and myth, is far greater than the discomfort of intellectual governance. If justice is an objective reality discoverable only through reason, then by failing to implement that justice politically, we are not merely making a mistake, we are committing a profound philosophical failure. The philosopher's role, therefore, becomes both the pinnacle of human achievement and its most demanding sacrifice. The idea of justice is often confined to the pages of law books, understood as a balance achieved through rules and regulations. We tend to view justice solely as an external mechanism, a set of societal controls designed to curb conflict and maintain superficial order. But for Plato, true justice must be something far deeper, woven into the very structure of the soul and reflected in the architecture of the state. He argued that law can only address surface discord. It cannot cure the sickness of the spirit. To grasp this ideal harmony, we must move beyond the temporary fixes offered by conventional jurisprudence. We need a blueprint for life itself, a comprehensive order where every component knows its natural and perfect role. This vision leads us back to the necessary structure ruled by pure reason. The self, like the city-state, is divided into parts, each with its function. Appetite, which seeks immediate gratification, spirit, providing energy and honor, and reason, seeking truth and understanding. Justice, in this internal sense, means that these three parts cooperate harmoniously, with reason reigning supreme. It does not mean equality, for the passions are inherently unequal. It means proper specialization and hierarchy. The rational mind must govern the unchecked desires and the spirited impulses. If this inner balance fails, if appetite rules through impulse or spirit overwhelms by pride, the individual soul falls into injustice, mirroring a chaotic city. The state, therefore, must be organized to mirror this internal harmony. Plato understood that if the parts of the soul are disordered, the resulting life is miserable and unjust. If the state structure fails to reflect reason's dominion, it remains merely a collection of competing appetites vying for power. Consider the role of law again. While necessary to establish minimum standards of conduct, to prevent the worst excesses of human greed or violence, law is inherently descriptive, not prescriptive in its deepest sense. Law can punish what has been done. It cannot proactively teach what ought to be done. It reacts to disorder rather than preventing the root cause of chaos. The philosopher's rule transcends this limitation. It does not merely enforce rules, it aims for transformation. The true ruler, guided by wisdom and detached from personal gain, works toward cultivating the virtues in citizens, cultivating the rational capacity before relying on punitive statutes. Their authority rests not on law codes or military might, but on their proven capacity to perceive universal truths. This necessity of wise leadership leads us back to the central dilemma. If justice requires a rationally ordered soul, and thus a rationally ordered state, why is it so difficult for human beings to achieve this order? The flaw lies in man's persistent gravitational pull toward the immediate. We are creatures easily distracted by shadows, by material wealth, by fleeting honor, by the satisfying whisper of appetite. These desires blind us to the enduring principles of the good and the just. The shepherd metaphor gains urgency here. The philosopher is not simply a lawgiver. He is an educator, guiding humanity away from its own comfortable ignorance. His burden is teaching people how to properly structure their inner lives so that they naturally contribute to a just external society. It is a constant state of intellectual and moral remediation. This understanding makes the withdrawal into mere theory profoundly unsatisfying. If we know the perfect form of justice, if we have grasped the forms, we cannot simply turn away because implementing it seems too difficult or unpopular. Knowing the truth creates an unavoidable imperative to act upon it. To possess the vision and then remain silent is, in Plato's view, itself a betrayal of reason. The philosopher-ruler thus becomes the guardian against societal decay. He must temper the raw energies of human emotion with pure contemplation. This requires immense sacrifice. The wise person must be willing to relinquish the titles, the wealth, and the personal freedom that society traditionally associates with power. True authority comes only from virtue, a source entirely independent of material reward. The system demands selfless service. If rulers base their decisions on what benefits themselves, a greater salary, more political influence, or simply popularity, the state will inevitably collapse into factional greed. Conversely, if they rule solely because reason dictates that this is the only path to true flourishing for all, then their leadership is pure and incorruptible. Ultimately, Plato suggests that justice is not merely an arrangement of laws among people. It is a harmonious rhythm achievable when philosophy guides both the individual soul and the collective city-state toward the realization of immutable truth. It is the final ascent from the mere observance of law to the lived experience of perfect order, requiring the enlightened hand of the philosopher. We have walked through the painful light, having seen the true shape of justice, and knowing that it is not found in laws or assemblies. We have explored how the perfect city must reflect the balanced soul, a place where reason holds command over passion and spirited impulse. But clarity itself carries an unimaginable weight. To see the whole pattern, the absolute structure of the ideal state, is to simultaneously recognize the utter limitation of human nature. That vision, so clear and perfectly rational, stands in jarring contrast to the chaotic, messy reality unfolding outside these philosophical discussions. I grasp now the profound dilemma faced by the philosopher king. If humanity cannot govern itself using only reason, then must the one who possesses pure understanding assume the burden of leadership. It is a choice weighed not against worldly gain or personal ambition, but against the fundamental moral imperative of realizing justice for all. To know the truth and to remain silent, thereby allowing widespread injustice to persist merely because the world is too resistant, feels itself an intolerable betrayal. I have spent our journey understanding that the life of the philosopher is one of deep sacrifice. Our true reward lies not in comfort, nor in power, but in intellectual purity, in the constant struggle towards the form of the good. This detachment from the material desires of common men is what makes us fit to rule. We cannot be swayed by gold or seduced by fame, because our vision has been trained away from their superficial allurements. Therefore, leadership becomes an ascetic calling, a self-denial that must precede any governance. The vow itself is not one of strength, but of sustained restraint. It is the promise to keep sight of the perfect blueprint, even when forced to navigate the unpredictable tides of politics and human folly. We are shepherds guiding wandering sheep who mistake noise for direction and mere habit for wisdom. Our task is not merely to enforce order, but gently to guide the citizens towards self-mastery. This guidance requires absolute objectivity. It demands that our ruling mind remain aloof from personal attachment or emotional investment in the outcome. I must understand that true governance is thus an act of continuous moral vigilance, a constant effort to remind the society, and ourselves, that justice is not merely the absence of crime. It is the active, rational alignment of every single part, appetites satisfying their natural needs, spirits fulfilling their role in courage, and reason guiding them both. This requires sacrifice beyond measure. The guardians must be trained for a life utterly divorced from private property, possessions, or family units, as we commonly understand them. To remove the competing gravitational forces of personal desire is to create an environment where pure rational thought can flourish unimpeded by attachment. Our collective existence becomes dedicated entirely to the maintenance of the state's highest intellectual aims. This structured asceticism is not a punishment, but a prerequisite for clear judgment. It means adopting a radical form of self-discipline, a discipline that touches every aspect of life, from what we consume to how we interact with one another. If the leaders are fundamentally undisciplined in their own souls, they cannot possibly structure an orderly society. The internal republic must be perfected before it can be projected outward. This is why self-mastery becomes the single most important political tool. The burden of knowing this ideal state, however, is heavy and often met with suspicion. Those who have never questioned their assumptions, those steeped in the comfortable shadows of convention, will view us not as guides, but as tyrants. They confuse necessary order with oppressive control, misunderstanding that our desire to guide them flows from a deep empathy, the recognition of their potential for goodness, even if currently masked by ignorance. I must therefore reconcile two profound truths. First, that the highest good is rational order, and second, that achieving this order requires a ceaseless commitment to self-abnegation. The philosopher does not rule because they love power. They rule because relinquishing their duty would constitute an intellectual failure of moral magnitude. It is the last resort of absolute necessity. I find myself continually contemplating the weight of this vow, the expectation that we must live a life of perpetual service, dedicating our utmost capacity solely to the flourishing of the entire community. We sacrifice personal happiness not because we are masochistic, but because true wisdom dictates that individual fulfillment is impossible where the collective pursuit of truth falters. Our happiness becomes synonymous with the justice and enlightenment of the city itself. This acceptance of profound self-limitation is the core virtue, the cornerstone of the philosopher's reign. It transforms the role from one of potential ruler to one of eternal, vigilant steward. We rule not by decree, but by example, by embodying the discipline we wish for the whole community to achieve. Our lives become a continuous demonstration that self-control and wisdom are not merely theoretical concepts, but achievable states of being. We have journeyed through the shadows of convention and into the difficult glare of truth. We understand now that the greatest threat to any polis is not external invasion, but internal decay, the erosion of self-discipline, the seduction of fleeting pleasures. If justice is to be restored, it must begin with a profound rejection of what society considers valuable, material comfort. This wisdom demands nothing less than radical asceticism for those who would lead. The philosopher, having ascended from the cave into the light, sees too clearly the illusions that bind the common citizen. They perceive how easily desire dictates action, leading to injustice in every transaction and decision. Therefore, if governance is truly rational, the leaders themselves must be immune to the temptations of appetite. Money, power, fame, these are merely shadows masquerading as ultimate goods, and letting them define a leader's life guarantees a corrupt state. This realization initiates the most difficult philosophical shift. True virtue dictates absolute detachment. The ruler cannot care for personal wealth or comfort because these attachments create conflicting desires. A man who loves gold may vote against a necessary but costly reform simply to protect his own holdings. A general motivated by glory might initiate needless wars merely to achieve renown. Such minds are incapable of designing or maintaining universal justice, which requires a steady hand guided only by immutable reason. The philosophy thus mandates that the custodians of the state, the philosophers, must renounce private property and familial claims as sources of defining identity. They must live simply, communally, relinquishing the trappings of individual desire. This is not merely an economic suggestion. It is a radical ethical cleansing necessary for intellectual purity to thrive. Consider the nature of self-discipline itself. When the internal life is chaotic, driven by lusts, envy, or ambition, the external governance must inevitably mirror that chaos. If one's inner peace is dependent on accumulating comforts, then the state will be equally unstable and petty. Only those who have mastered their own appetites can govern justly, because they are not beholden to them. The life of the philosopher-guardian, therefore, becomes a sustained vow against self-interest. It is an existence characterized by objectivity and rigorous mental training. Every decision made in the city must be filtered through the pure light of reason, divorced entirely from personal benefit or emotional whim. This detachment allows for an unparalleled capacity for foresight. They see not what will satisfy them today, but what will sustain the state across generations. The concept of shared resources and communal living thus emerges as a logical necessity, stemming directly from ethical principle. Private property ties the soul to materialism, making it vulnerable to injustice when that material loss occurs. Communal ownership minimizes attachment, elevating collective well-being above individual gain. The man's identity becomes intrinsically linked not to what he possesses, but to his commitment to the common good. This refusal of material comfort is perhaps the most profound sacrifice required by any form of enlightened rule. It requires choosing a life of disciplined virtue over a life of luxurious ease. The philosopher accepts that their reward will be nothing more than the successful ordering of the state, and perhaps nothing at all for themselves. It is this necessary rejection of selfish interest that elevates them above mere politicians or wealthy oligarchs. These other classes are inherently motivated by what they have to lose, what they can gain, or what they enjoy right now. But the truly enlightened mind operates in a realm beyond such calculations. It seeks only the truth and the optimal condition for humanity. The burden of this clarity is immense. They must walk through society knowing that their voluntary poverty and detachment will be interpreted not as superior wisdom, but perhaps as cold indifference or even ridicule by those who live immersed in comfort. They must withstand the accusation that they have forfeited all human warmth, the warmth of shared goods, the warmth of private achievement, in favor of a harsh, intellectual ideal. They are shepherds carrying the flock toward dawn, and their crook is not made of force or law enforcement alone, but of relentless example. By living without attachment to possessions or status, they demonstrate daily that rational order is possible, even desirable. It is through this unwavering refusal to compromise virtue for comfort that they carve out a pathway toward the just state. Their commitment serves as the intellectual cornerstone upon which the ideal society must rest. Without this radical ethical discipline at its core, any governmental structure remains fragile, prone to the inevitable gravitational pull back towards self-interest and material vanity. We have traveled through the external realm of city-states and laws, examining how societies attempt to achieve justice through structure. But we must now turn inward to find the true source of governance, because the state is merely a reflection of the soul. Before we can build a just city, we must first establish a just inner self. The greatest ruler is not found in public life, but within the confines of our own minds and desires. This transition requires an intense act of introspection, shifting our focus from the physical borders of the polis to the sacred geography of the individual soul. Consider the human being as a microcosm, perfectly mirroring the city itself. If we understand how the elements of the state, reason, spirit, and appetite, interact externally, we must understand their corresponding forms within us. The ideal society demands that reason guides all other impulses. Likewise, the well-ordered soul requires that reason preside over our appetites and passions. This recognition creates an immediate and profound shift in responsibility. Our first struggle is not against tyrants or corrupt laws, but against the chaos of unexamined desires. The inner life is a battleground where forces constantly compete for control. Appetite, that raw desire for pleasure, wealth, and immediate gratification, often shouts the loudest. Spirit, fueled by honor, anger, and ambition, can be equally volatile, leading us to acts of impulsive defense or excessive pride. But it is reason, pure intellect, the faculty capable of grasping universal truths, that must ultimately provide the steady hand. Only reason has the capacity for true self-mastery. It does not merely manage emotion, It understands the deep structure of harmony itself. The challenge here is fundamentally philosophical. How do we train this internal sovereign? We cannot govern what we have not first understood. The path to inner rule demands rigorous self-examination and a profound acceptance of limitation. We must learn which desires are merely whispers fueled by fear or social conditioning, and which impulses spring from genuine, reasoned understanding of the good. This requires the death of comforting illusion, replacing it with the sometimes painful clarity of truth about ourselves. This internal architecture serves as the ultimate blueprint for governance. Plato suggests that if a man cannot rule himself, if his desires constantly pull him toward excess or distraction, then he is unfit to rule any city. To govern others merely means transferring your own undisciplined chaos onto a wider stage, resulting in injustice on a massive scale. Therefore, the pursuit of the philosopher must be understood as an intensely personal and ethical project before it can become a civic one. The concept of justice shifts from being simply following laws to embodying internal harmony. A just person is not merely compliant. They are perfectly balanced, acting solely according to reason, irrespective of how that action affects their immediate desires or what the crowd believes. This internalized discipline suggests that true freedom is synonymous with self-control. It is the voluntary rejection of the immediate and the familiar in favor of the challenging but necessary truth. This internal vow parallels the external vows made by the guardians, a commitment to objectivity, detached from personal gain. Consider the daily practice of philosophical living. It is a constant negotiation between what we want immediately and what we know is truly beneficial long-term. We must cultivate detachment. Detachment does not mean apathy. It means recognizing that your happiness or virtue cannot be held hostage by external circumstances, not by wealth, not by reputation, nor even by the applause of others. It means understanding that the only stable ground we have is the purity of our reasoned judgment. The philosophical journey inward is thus a gradual act of sublimation. We take raw, unruly emotional energy and redirect it into intellectual contemplation. The passion that once fueled vengeful anger, for instance, can be transformed by reason into the steadfast commitment to justice itself, a disinterested care for the good order. Similarly, the fierce pride associated with recognition must be tempered by the humble acceptance of one's role in a larger, rationally ordered whole. The ultimate realization is that the life lived according to pure reason, free from personal attachment and emotional impulse, is not just better for the individual. It is the only sustainable model for human civilization. The philosopher who masters their inner state provides the necessary moral bedrock for any society hoping to escape its cycles of folly. They offer a vision rooted in eternal truths, a wisdom that transcends the temporary fluctuations of public opinion or political expediency. This inward journey, therefore, is not merely spiritual self-help. It is the precondition for political stability itself. The greatest empire we can build is one started with the discipline of the mind over the flesh. We have journeyed through the necessity of self-mastery. We learned that the inner republic must be ordered before we can hope to build a just external city. Our discipline, our detachment from comfort and desire, was not an end in itself, but preparation for a calling greater still, the guidance of others. If true justice is merely an internal harmony, then the political philosopher becomes fundamentally an ethical guide, rather than a mere lawgiver or politician. The ruler's role shifts entirely. It ceases to be about command and enforcement. It transforms into something far gentler, yet profoundly difficult: shepherding. Consider the nature of true knowledge. Knowledge itself is not power in the common understanding of the word. Power often suggests force, coercion, or the ability to dominate others' will. But the philosopher knows that humanity cannot be coerced toward truth. It can only be guided. To demand compliance through state decree fails when confronted with the sheer weight of irrational human appetites and passions. The calling of the philosopher is thus redefined. They are not conquerors, nor administrators in the usual sense. They are shepherds, watching over a flock that often wanders aimlessly, distracted by shadows of momentary pleasure and the loud calls of immediate gratification. Their task is patient direction. This transition is critical to understanding Plato's vision. The state does not need brute force. It needs continuous illumination. It requires someone who has gazed upon the forms, the perfect blueprints of justice, virtue, and goodness, and who possesses the steady gaze to show others what they are missing. They must lead humanity not through decrees signed in political halls, but through reasoned example. The challenge for this ideal shepherd is immense because their labor never truly ends. The flock will always stray. Some will follow the lure of gold, some the thrill of rhetoric and immediate reward. The philosopher cannot afford the satisfaction of a single great achievement or revolution. Their commitment must be enduring, cyclical, maintaining the vigilance necessary to gently redirect souls back toward the path of reason. This is why governance becomes an act of perpetual moral care. It demands not just intellect, but boundless patience and compassion, qualities that are difficult even for those who have attained clarity. The shepherd cannot merely point a finger at error. They must patiently walk beside the lost sheep until it recognizes its own vulnerability and seeks guidance. We see here the profound difference between rule by law, which is brittle and conditional, and rule by wisdom, which is adaptive and deeply personal. Law addresses visible behavior, but only wisdom addresses invisible motivation, the deep desires that make men prone to injustice in the first place. The philosopher must intervene at this source, retraining the soul of the community. The shepherd's knowledge, therefore, gives them a unique perspective on time and consequence. They do not judge based on immediate political outcomes or temporary popular favor. Their goal is the ultimate human potential, intellectual flourishing. They are stewards of the collective consciousness, holding humanity accountable to its highest self, its true rational nature. The weight of this responsibility requires the same radical detachment we discussed earlier. If the shepherd becomes attached to the success of his flock, if he takes personal credit for their eventual wisdom, or grows weary from seeing them err time and time again, his guidance fails. The commitment must be absolute, viewed not as a patriotic service, but as an inescapable duty born out of intellectual necessity. It is this understanding that moves us toward the heart of Plato's argument. Ruling is the highest possible expression of virtue for those who have glimpsed true reality. It is the ultimate sacrifice, swapping the freedom of pure contemplation, the philosopher's natural habitat, for the grueling, unpredictable service to mankind. The shepherd must choose the difficult path over the comfortable solitude. The process is therefore highly educational for every soul involved. The shepherds guide through example, teaching that true happiness resides not in having one's desires met, but in aligning oneself with universal truth. They model self-restraint daily, demonstrating that moderation and reasoned choice are the highest forms of personal freedom. To be a philosopher shepherd is to live constantly at the intersection of theory and practice. One must possess the sublime contemplative depth required to grasp the forms, yet also the empathetic practicality to descend into the messy lives of ordinary people, the farmers, the artisans, the politicians, and speak their language of immediate need without compromising the purity of one's vision. The goal remains the same: a harmonious community where every action is reasoned and every individual understands that their unique role contributes harmoniously to the whole. It is an ordered city, but one achieved not by decree, but by gentle persuasion, constant care, and the illumination provided by those who refuse to believe merely in shadows. We have arrived at the most profound and paralyzing point of thought. The accumulated weight of wisdom places us before a great dilemma. What do we do with the knowledge? We have traveled from the shadows of assumed reality to the blinding light of pure, rational truth. This clarity has gifted us understanding, the perfect blueprint for justice, the optimal architecture of the state, and the disciplined soul. Yet this very perfection confronts the messy, unpredictable struggle of human action. The greatest weight is the disparity between what we know to be true and what humanity is capable of accepting or enacting. We understand that justice requires reason to govern all other impulses. It demands a rigorous self-mastery that few have ever achieved. This understanding creates an agonizing tension. Do we possess the wisdom, but lack the means to implement it? Is knowledge inherently useless if it cannot reshape society? Consider this chasm of despair. On one side rests pure theory, the perfect ideal state, governed by those whose lives are dedicated solely to truth. The other side is reality, a city-state inhabited by individuals driven by appetites, ruled by law that accommodates passion and ambition, and fundamentally resistant to deep change. To bridge this gap requires an act of incredible will, or perhaps nothing at all. The philosopher stands on the threshold, burdened by a perfect vision, observing a humanity still tethered to its foundational ignorance. He sees not only what should be, but also how deeply incapable we are of attaining that ideal through our own self-correction. The truth is painful because it exposes the limits of human will and collective understanding. The dilemma asks, does profound knowledge necessitate political action? Should the philosopher, who has achieved intellectual detachment from material corruption, abandon contemplative solitude to engage in the brutal mechanisms of statecraft? Or should he withdraw, recognizing that his wisdom would only be weaponized, misunderstood, and ultimately wasted upon a population unwilling to evolve? This is the moment where moral necessity clashes with practical futility. To act politically requires compromise. To dilute the purity of reason for the sake of palatability or survival. To remain silent means abandoning the highest calling, the duty to guide souls toward the light. The temptation to retreat into the contemplation and sheer beauty of forms, thereby keeping our knowledge safe from the filth of the physical world, is overwhelmingly strong. But the weight of that perfect vision demands a reckoning. If we truly understand the nature of justice, that it is internal harmony and objective reason, not mere agreement or force, then remaining passive feels like a betrayal. It suggests that truth itself has no power to compel change. The very act of knowing becomes an obligation. We must face whether the highest moral virtue resides in pure contemplation or in the agonizing service of guiding others toward enlightenment. The philosopher begins to weigh these paths with brutal honesty. He sees that simply stating the perfect laws is not enough. He must become the living embodiment of those principles, the self-sacrificing guide who chooses burden over bliss. The conclusion reached here is one of profound, weary conviction. even if the odds are impossible, and even if his efforts only lead to ridicule or outright failure, inaction itself constitutes a form of deeper injustice. He realizes that the journey toward truth is not merely an intellectual exercise. It is a continuous, demanding process of ethical intervention into human affairs. This recognition marks the ultimate struggle, accepting that the sheer weight of knowing requires action. It shifts the understanding of philosophy from mere contemplation to perpetual service. The goal changes from achieving personal wisdom for its own sake to becoming the enduring source of inquiry and moral impetus for civilization itself, even if we cannot establish the perfect state on Earth, a feat which seems nearly impossible given human nature. The sustained act of rigorous self-examination and critical questioning remains the ultimate good. It is a continuous rebellion against complacency, a necessary spark passed from one mind to the next. Thus, while utopia may remain out of reach, the philosopher's commitment to relentless inquiry becomes both his life's duty and society's only reliable beacon. We stand now at the threshold of knowledge, faced with the immense weight of what we know to be true. The arduous journey through the cave has taught us that mere certainty is often just a convincing illusion, woven from social habit and unchallenged opinion. We have grappled with the painful clarity required to see beyond shadows, recognizing that truth itself demands radical self-discipline and detachment. Our exploration led us to the profound necessity of internal harmony, the alignment of our reason, our spirit, and our appetites within the single soul. But philosophy never ends at the individual. It necessarily expands outward, demanding we contemplate the structure and function of the community itself. If the state is merely a reflection of the balanced soul, then true justice must be engineered by those who have successfully navigated this difficult internal architecture. The central question remains: if only pure reason can grasp the universal forms, the ideal definitions of good and justice, can anything outside the sphere of pure intellect ever be truly just? We learned that governance cannot simply be a job. It must be a radical ethical commitment, one that demands the relinquishing of self-interest entirely. To govern means to prioritize the enduring stability of the community over the fleeting comfort or wealth of the individual leader. This is not an ambition born from ego, but a painful necessity derived from intellectual purity itself. We examined how systems based on passion, greed, and mere appetite always crumble into chaos, regardless of their laws or rituals. Such states are simply reflections of unbalanced souls, where desire governs deliberation, or where spirit overrides reason. Therefore, the task falls to those who have undergone the deepest self-examination, the philosophers. Their detachment from worldly concerns is not a flaw, but their greatest strength. It makes them immune to the corrupting influence of power and profit. They possess the ability to see the underlying structural reality, the true form of justice itself, and thereby design a societal order that mirrors this perfect intellectual clarity. This vision requires sacrificing personal comfort, requiring the guardians to live without private property or familial desires as we understand them. It demands an absolute objectivity, seeing human fallibility and collective ignorance with clear, unblinking rationality. Yet, even after charting this idealized republic, a state ruled by wisdom's careful hand, the daunting question returns: is it possible? We face the tension between knowing the ultimate truth of how things ought to be and the messy, resistant reality of how they actually are. This intellectual impasse has weighed heavily on us. To intervene is to risk failure against flawed human nature. But to remain silent is to concede that injustice has no moral check beyond pure reason. It forces a confrontation with despair. We contemplated withdrawing from politics entirely, arguing that perhaps wisdom's best service lies in quiet contemplation, the pursuit of the good for its own sake. Yet, this withdrawal feels like an unacceptable abdication of moral responsibility. The realization dawns that the sheer brilliance of philosophical insight is useless if it remains confined to academic discourse or private reflection. It must be applied, even at great personal cost. What if perfect implementation is impossible? What if the state resists all rational guidance? We cannot allow the highest pursuit, the understanding of truth, to wither away because the world around us seems too deeply rooted in illusion. Therefore, we must conclude that while the establishment of a perfect polis might remain an unattainable dream, the continuous act of inquiry itself retains its unparalleled value. Philosophy is not merely preparation for rule. It is the moral imperative for civilized existence. The journey through thought, the relentless questioning of assumed truths, and the dedication to self-mastery. This process, even if never fully realized in a perfect state, is the highest calling. It serves as humanity's constant rebellion against stagnation, its ethical compass against decay. We must teach each other how to doubt correctly, how to find stability within our own rationality, and how to build lives anchored in principle rather than pleasure. This ongoing vigilance is the bedrock upon which all true civilization must be laid. The life of disciplined inquiry thus becomes not just a philosophical pursuit, but an enduring societal necessity, a perpetual act of moral architecture that saves us from falling back into the comfort of shadows. It ensures that